Well, hello. My name is Rand Wentworth. I'm not Joe Aldi. Joe is on vacation with his children during vacation week here in Massachusetts. So he asked me, I'm based at the Center for Public Leadership and teach a class in climate leadership. So today we are in a hybrid program. So there's those of us who are right here in Cambridge, but there's hundreds of people who are watching this live stream, and it will also be available for you to come back and look at the content or tell your friends to look at it. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Basil Seggos. Basil is an attorney with Foley Hoag, and for many years he was Commissioner of the Environment for the state of New York. Actually, the longest serving Commissioner of the Environment in New York history. So he's got something, he's patient and perseverant. Um, so Basil, I know from his leadership role where he was supervising his professional team was over 3,000 people. He was in charge of all kinds of environmental climate issues. He was instrumental in the passage of some nation leading initiatives on climate change law and climate leadership. I was especially impressed and knew of the work of a $4.2 billion funding package on clean water, clean air, green jobs, and also the Clean Water Infrastructure Act, $5.5 billion. So Basil was there at the, hand on the tiller as we were sailing into the first Trump administration. There was a lot of work that the state and local governments did at that time and some lessons learned that we'll explore today. But this is a new world and there's different conditions, and we'd like very much to hear from Basil about what's different now and what we can learn and what we can accomplish. So Basil, you want to say an opening word?
Sure. Thank you, Rand. Good afternoon, everybody. Really great to be here. Rand, I don't know if you all know Rand, but not only a fantastic professor here, but was a national leader on preserving land Trust Alliance. That if you've ever driven around in your communities and seen small pocket parks, sometimes large tracts, really vulnerable land that was set aside, that was often done by a land trust, right? And that's done in concert with a lot of these large organizations like the Land Trust Alliance. So RAND is responsible for giving people a lot of access to nature, which is a great thing to reflect back on now on Earth Week, right? Which started 55 years ago, 55th Earth Day tomorrow. So really a chance to look back at the last 5+ decades, what we've accomplished, where we're going. When I was at DC, the 50th Earth Day came along and we had a whole year mapped out as to how we would celebrate that. That was February 2020. We decided to launch this initiative. And then a few days later, the world ground to a halt, and we decided we needed to do bigger things, operating vaccine centers, drive-through testing facilities, obviously responding to the pandemic. So now 55, we have a different chance to reflect to sort of where we are, where we're going. So, I titled this originally a few months ago when I sort of thought about, Rand invited me and Joe to speak. What would I want to say? And this is a couple of months ago. Can the states lead as the feds retreat on the environment? And I think back then, I intended to come in here and talk a lot about what we've done, what we had done the first trip through the Trump administration back in 2016, and what lessons we might learn this time around. I didn't think we'd be as far backwards as we are today. Just what an unprecedented 100 days this has been, 100 days on April 30th. How challenging it's been for many groups, many of us in the legal profession, those of us who were in government, to get our hands around sort of where we're going with the environment. I did not intend this to be a political speech, and it will certainly not be one. But I say that to note that we're in the most unprecedented moment in, I think, our nation's history when it comes to issues right, left, and center. Environment is one of those. So this week provides us a chance to reflect back on the importance of Earth Day. Why was it originally founded? You know, what did it lead to in terms of our nation's laws and regulations, and where might we take our collective work? I say our, you know, the millions of people involved in this movement now, billions of people probably internationally who care about nature. So just a little bit about myself. Yep, I was at DEC running the state's environmental agency for 8.5 years. Prior to that, I worked for the governor in his office as deputy secretary for the environment, which is sort of more of a policy position than an operational one. I'd come from private sector, doing some work with a family office on water investments, clean air investments, and recycling. Prior to that, I was in the nonprofit world. So Riverkeeper on the Hudson River, Natural Resources Defense Council, where I got my first job out of college. And I was in law school as well. 8.5 years in the Army as well as a reservist. And all that sort of informed my work when I was at DEC. So I did take the helm at DEC at a very interesting moment. It was 2015, where we sort of at the tail end of the first environmental movement. And I say tail end because it was sort of the chunk of laws and regulations and staff at the agency that had kind of come into the regulatory world were aging out. Literally, they were at their edge of their retirement. We had the old way of doing things at the agency, and lo and behold, we were confronting immediately new crises. Most specifically, I looked at New Hampshire right now, PFAS, which was an emerging contaminant at the time we knew almost nothing about. That happened about 2 weeks into my job, and we lost a village and its water supply called Hoosick Falls. And we went from an environmental agency, which is focused largely on the outdoors and, of course, in regulation, into an operational one. I had to deploy 600 people to basically bring water into people's homes for the course of many months on end, and then find new water supplies, which just a few weeks ago, finally we completed. So that was the beginning of my trip there in that agency. And you know, we thought we were ready for the next big thing, which was going to be climate change at that time. And then Trump was elected the first time around, which I think put us all on our heels. You know, we searching for the answer. What do states do when the first thing that the president does is pull us out of the Paris Accords, right, on this global climate issue? Pulls us away from all the other nations in that body, which would have brought us together and helped us to find solutions. So the states stepped up at that time. I mean, New York was one of them. We immediately created the what's called the U.S. Climate Alliance with the governors of California and Washington, and tried to fill some of that gap. So what can states do, right? We tried to fill some of that gap in the regulation of carbon emissions and the emergence and the support of this new burgeoning economy and clean energy. It took us about 2.5 years, but we got the what's New York Times called the nation's leading climate law enacted, signed, and rolling. We also began discussions on the Bond Act, right? This $4.2 billion Bond Act, which the voters didn't get to, I think, until 2022. But that all began with that simple question: you know, if we don't have federal leadership, what can states do to step up and stand up together and ultimately try to course forward? Resources began flowing in. It was the Bond Act. We also dramatically increased our water money. That was largely because of the PFAS problem that we had. We were able to talk to the legislature and the people saying, you know, we need to put our resources into places that will solve problems for New Yorkers and be good government. Of course, in the tail end of the Flint debacle as well, that sort of added some extra heft behind getting us resources, important resources. So there's a great story about how, you know, certainly negative thing happened at the federal level. We were able to step up and increase our work and ultimately create some really big successes. You know, became the #1 state in the country on community solar. You know, we had a very ambitious, the largest offshore wind commitment of any state in the country. We started rebuilding our transmission grid, becoming a modern functioning state. And ultimately, I think the ambition in New York was always to try to lead, to try to be first on everything. If we couldn't be first, we'd learn from others. Giving full credit to our friends on the West Coast, who'd obviously charted out an incredible path on so many environmental initiatives. So that was the instinct then. I think it worked. I think it helped bring states together. You know, the idea that first week to establish the Climate Alliance then grew to 24 states, which was slightly bipartisan, but it was bipartisan. We had a couple of Republican states in there. And that helped us to galvanize national action. So we could go to went to COP in the Council of Parties in Glasgow, with not just New York, but New York with 24 other states, which, by the way, is not just the majority of the nation's population. It is also the majority of the nation's GDP represented in those 24 states. So there's some real action that we could bring to the table. Most of the work that came out of that Climate Alliance at our level and many other states was just the low-hanging fruit. Just go after the things right now that we are not doing. And in most cases, it was we don't have laws and regulations on the books to control carbon emissions. So I'd call that low-hanging fruit. Obviously, very difficult to get a climate law through a legislature in any state. It certainly was in New York. And all of the various things we had to do to convince communities, in fact, that it was worth the risk of binding our state to those targets and developing the new economy, the new green energy economy, in a way that would lift all communities up. So have really powerful environmental justice components to the law itself, which would then direct all those, at least 40% of the funds, back into frontline communities. So we really were proud of what we built at that time, but that was still low-hanging fruit. And I think if you ask most of the other state commissioners what they were doing at the time, it was really hard. Then 2021, 22 comes along, next administration. We have our state laws. Federal government now is making a massive investment in renewable energy, a massive investment in frontline communities, and we're off to the races, right? The nation becomes one of the most ambitious and aggressive nations in the world, if not the most, on pivoting to that new economy, that new clean energy economy. So in a way, we had great lessons. We learned quite a bit in that first go round. We were able to, find ways to engage at the grassroots and get grassroots thinking, up through the chain, up to the chief executive of a state, and really, how do you get things done? It's done with big coalitions, and it's done by looking across borders. This time around, it's going to be a lot harder. I will tell you that for a few reasons. I'm not in government anymore. I'm in the private sector. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But it's going to be harder now because the low-hanging fruit's been picked off the tree, right? We already have the laws. We also have billions of dollars of projects already underway. Most notably, as you probably saw last week, a noteworthy project in New York called Empire Wind, which has about 1,000 union jobs, construction underway. I was just telling Rand, the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal right now is a huge construction site. And there's cranes and front loaders and concrete being poured in the ground for this offshore wind project. And the president put a hold on that, just stopped it midstream. So it's 1,000 people that went home for Easter, not knowing if they're going to get back on their jobs. I think they will, but what I think doesn't really matter. What matters is that's one project. There are thousands of projects like that around the country where they don't have the certainty if they're going to move forward. So low-hanging fruit is the law, right? The investment is when things become real and become tangible and become food on tables for people. So banks have to fund those projects, right? Governments are giving permits, banks underwriting projects like that. Now you're pulling projects away. So are you going to have the bank when the project's back online? Are you going to have the financing? Are you going to have your permits? You can have those international trade deals. So that in one way is going to make it really challenging. The next way it's going to be challenging is because we don't operate in a vacuum in the environment. I mean, Earth Day isn't just Earth Day. It's really everything, right? I hate to sound grandiose about it, but we obviously have just our planet, and our planet relies on international cooperation. And whether it's for air, water, climate issues, economic trade, of course. And it's no secret, I'm not an economist. I don't work for CNBC, but our economy's perhaps at a teetering point right now. If you've got 401ks, you certainly know it. If you're watching what's going on at the economic level with the economy, if you're looking at the tariffs issues, what other nations are, how they're viewing us as a place to invest. It's going to make it challenging for green energy in New York because, in a way, the state could fill some of the gaps in financing these projects. But if we have a bad economic year, that means we're not getting bonuses on Wall Street. If we're not getting bonuses on Wall Street, we're not getting tax revenue to fund these projects at the state level. So everything is related, right? Which makes it an incredibly challenging moment. So I think states can step up. States can lead. Now, we're one state. There's 49 others. Red and blue, I think, aligned in principle as to what we're doing in terms of this investment. But obviously now we can't do this without a strong federal presence. We learned that during the Biden years when things looked bleak. Biden was able to work with Congress to establish the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, get all those dollars, those billions of dollars into the economy, and it was working. So I think we have some serious headwinds ahead of us right now. We probably ask ourselves, what can we do? And it's nice to be at a place like Harvard that you can see what can be done with the decisions of an institution, right? The tone that is set. Congratulations, Harvard, for holding the line, and for standing up for yourself, standing up for what's right, doing what's right, which sometimes can't be easy. You may not know it, but in my circle, at least, doing a Harvard has become a phrase that's being used. Just do a Harvard, because people want to see they want to see the sort of schoolyard tussle go the right way. And it's inspiring to be at a place like this that has stood up for what's right and for their own interests, and ultimately set a tone, I believe, that's going to be contagious. So we can certainly talk more about, Rand's got a number of really great questions. I look forward to your questions if you stick around for those. But I would say I'm happy where I am right now. Why? I mean, I'm not in government. It's obviously when things are falling apart, you sort of want to be in government, honestly. You want to be able to have to exert some influence on decision making. You can do more in a day in these government jobs than you can in months or years on the outside. I mean, I say that often, and it's true. I mean, if you are a line staff at an agency, you can effectuate change. If you're an executive at an agency, you can effectuate massive change. It's harder on the outside, but I went to a law firm called Foley Hoag here in Boston, based in Boston, offices in New York, Denver, DC, and Paris, for one reason. The firm believes in its mission. And I'm so proud to be part of it. We are one of the leading, if not the leading, law firms for clean energy in the country. Not a large law firm, 370 lawyers, but we're really effective at what we do. And so I was proud to go to a firm that substantively had a mission and could help clients get through tough times. And that's what we're doing right now. We also stood for something bigger. We were one of 7 law firms in the top 200 law firms to sign the amicus brief on behalf of the Perkins case, which, if you remember from many days ago, was an attack on the legal profession. So we stood up, we said no to that. One of 7 firms, and we think we probably would have expected more to be part of that, but 7 total. We also earned an A rating from Law Students for Climate Accountability. It's our 5th, I think our 4th or 5th in a row. And we have held fast on our DEI principles. We've not taken that down from our website. We believe it. It's a part of our values. So going to a place like Foley Hoag now, and we looked at the data a couple of days ago. If you take those 3 things in, law students, the Perkins amicus brief, and DEI, we're one of 3 law firms in America of any size that have those 3 things that they can say. So you can go anywhere in life and create change. It doesn't need to be in government. But if you go to a law firm, make sure it's Foley. So why don't we talk a little bit about Rand's questions? I know you've got some great ones in there. And then we'll talk a bit more about your questions.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for being here. So going back to the halcyon days, and it was Trump's first round, I'm just interested, and we'll get to the current challenge, but I'm interested how you convinced your governor, the legislature, to make a big bet on green infrastructure, climate infrastructure, clean water. These are huge numbers, and probably most legislators, most governors would say, Basil, why don't you just find something comfortable to do?
You're assuming I didn't get that.
So what were the politics to shoot high?
Yeah. Well, look, I think we in New York, obviously, has been a leader on environmental issues for many years, and a very strong public support for environmental investments. The bottle bill, the original Storm King case, the Environmental Protection Fund had been around for many years.
The work on the Hudson.
Work on the Hudson, right? Cleaning up the Hudson, going back to the 1970s, 60s. Pete Seeger, exactly. So all that came out of New York. So, I honestly, when I took the job, I was stepping into huge shoes. People before me had already, laid the groundwork for some of the work that we needed to do. I think what I tried to do is come in and, hit the ground and, not be in my office much, really get out into the street, go out into communities and try to learn from them what they were facing, what their problems were. The Hoosick Falls example was a powerful one because I think that showed us pretty plainly that we had decaying infrastructure. We had outdated standards. We had a bureaucratic machine that wasn't prepared to handle it, right? How do you parachute in and provide water for 4,000 people immediately? Yeah. So we had to get creative immediately. So my view was I needed to effectively communicate to my principal and to the legislature what the problems were and what the solutions could be. And that sounds pretty plain to say, but it's quite clear. You have something like Superstorm Sandy that hits New York City, hits New Jersey, New York in 2012, and water from the harbor is pouring into the World Trade Center pit. I mentioned this last time that we spoke here. That was a bit of a paradigm shift, I would say, in New York. Where you said all these communities were losing their people, losing lives, people losing infrastructure, and then seeing that water pouring into the pit, I think, was a reminder that we have a much bigger problem on our hands. So I viewed my job as to be the annoying guy who had some ideas, really from our smart people, channel smart ideas through our bureaucracy into the decision-making realm, and to be persistent about it, right? And to recognize that we didn't have all the answers, but we needed to develop some answers. That's what led to these investments and ultimately to the laws you mentioned in the beginning.
So Basil, we're leaning into a climate emergency. The Biden administration passes some pretty extraordinary, the infrastructure bill, the IRA. And there's the opportunity for local and state governments to really lead, but they've got the federal funding kind of wind in their sails. What happens now for local and state on big infrastructure, green transportation?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And that's the question of the day. And how do we keep projects alive right now? And it's really a twofold problem. It's the money, right? It's the federal incentives, either through grants or tax credits, or the permits themselves, existing environmental review and permits, or permits that have already been issued that are now being called into question. So those two things right there are
going to fight it in the courts.
We're going to have to, right? Projects are going to have to assert their rights in court, and ultimately look to states to and the private sector ultimately to provide some of that financial support.
Well, speaking of executive orders, how many of us are tired of reading today yet another executive order? Yes. It'll wear you out, but let me read you one from 2 weeks ago, signed by President Trump. It's entitled Protecting American Energy from State Overreach, in which he, bear with me here, it's a little legalese, but he directs the U.S. Attorney General to, quote, identify all state and local laws, regulations, causes of action, burdening the identification, development, siting, production of domestic energy that may be unconstitutional by federal law or otherwise unenforceable. So this executive order directs the Attorney General to gather everything that every state and local government is doing related to climate and the environment, and the Attorney General is to decide which of those are not legal and should be shut down immediately. Now, there's been so many executive orders, you could be forgiven for missing this one, but this is a huge assault. It's not just like not funding local state action. It's saying what you're doing is illegal, your basic infrastructure of regulation and the like. So, for example, California's cap and trade program would be under attack. Vermont's climate superfund, which requires fossil fuel companies to pay damages for greenhouse gas. So these are, this is a massive assault. All of this is supposed to be done in 60 days. So Basil, you're an attorney. Help me understand, does the president have the power to do this? And I always thought, well, does the federal government preempt any state and local policy? I always thought, like looking at California, that if they're stricter than federal law, that you have that option. But tell me that I missed this and that actually it's going to be all right.
I'm going to stand up because I can't see the back. States' rights, right?
Yeah.
Except
Federalism.
now. So it's an EO, right? It's not yet an actionable item. We still don't know what will come out of the EO, how this investigation will play out, and what ultimately what actions the DOJ will take against state programs. I think they will have an enormously difficult challenge ahead of them. There are these state programs, most of them have been crafted and have withstood local litigation or multi-state litigation for many, many years. I think about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is going to be one of these programs that may get targeted, right? Multi-state initiative to lower greenhouse gas emissions from the from the power sector. You mentioned cap and trade on the West Coast. There's a few states connected to that. New York has a burgeoning cap and trade program right now that's going through program development. The EO is even broader than what you mentioned, because it actually puts in bracket quotes words like climate or environmental justice. So in a way, if you read the EO, it would give the DOJ gives the DOJ direction to go after any state program that mentions any of those things, much less has a view of them.
So yet again, AI will help us.
AI will help us. So it's hard to opine as to the legality of it, but I think what they're going to come up against obviously is federalism itself, Commerce Clause issues, certainly issues of states' rights, First Amendment. I mean, there are some very significant constitutional challenges that the federal government would have to overcome to shut down a state's largely a climate program or an environmental program or an environmental justice program. So it is, I'd say, hold your fire for now. Keep your powder dry. Okay. It's going to be a fight, and we are ultimately up against a number of these kind of ill-conceived executive orders, and we'll be fighting on a few fronts.
So reminding you all of civics class, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution states that the powers not delegated to the United States government by Constitution, nor prohibited by states, are reserved for the states.
Yes.
It's very explicit about that. Well, let's take one of these local actions that's in your backyard, mm-hmm. The congestion pricing in Manhattan. Took, what, 30 years to get there, finally up and running? And the president says, by executive order, that can no longer be so. So what's the path forward?
Well, congestion pricing is working right now. It's in effect. If you've been into New York City, as I have recently, it's astounding, actually, how it's changed traffic patterns in New York City. And it's astounding because the street's also really crowded with pedestrians. People are actually still coming to New York, perhaps not in the numbers we would have liked because of the tariffs and other actions international, but we still have a huge amount of people using New York, people taking mass transit in, and amazing amount of revenue coming out of congestion pricing going into largely mass transit projects because we have switches and these subway access issues, certainly pedestrian access issues in the subway system that is reflective of a 110-year-old 120-year-old system. So we have huge burdens. So will the EO actually end up in canceling congestion pricing? Likely not. The challenge that the president has at this point is to make the case that the decisions made by the state of New York, Port Authority, MTA, were somehow in contravention of national law, of federal law, right? Or the environmental review wasn't sufficient enough. And if you remember, it feels like 30 years, but really the last 10 have been the most difficult. The amount of debate, dialogue, review, study, analysis that has gone into congestion pricing has been extraordinary.
Yep.
Probably more than any other program that the state has put together in the last 30 or 40 years. So I think it withstands that scrutiny.
And the governor's standing up.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yep.
So what are the prospects for local state government to advance wind and solar and transmission lines?
Yeah.
To what extent is the market able to drive these things?
I think, listen, we have an enormous amount of growth certainly in solar right now in New York. Solar not being one of the industries that's really in the focus of the first set of EOs. Wind is a little bit different. We are a leading state on wind. We have a huge amount of wind power going into upstate New York. There's actually repowering of old wind farms now in upstate New York. Offshore wind, I mentioned, underway, but now very much in the sights, in the targets of the president. And there's a question as to how quickly we can get those projects through without their support, their not just financial and from a tax perspective and grant perspective, but from a permitting perspective. So that's certainly in jeopardy, at least in the short term. But communities want clean energy. I mean, most of the communities in New York State are climate smart communities. They've asked for resources for planning or for actual investments to make that transition to clean energy. So we know the communities, the demand is there, the local demand is there, moving over to LED lighting from the old lighting. putting in EV stations so that people can charge, park downtown, investments in walkable streets, all of those kinds of things are coming out of the investments we made in New York State. But it goes back to goes back to the federal level, right? If we're not creating the conditions that are conducive on the market side for the creation of these widgets that we need for the new economy, right? If we are actually creating tariff barriers for the import of products that we need to kind of create that system, that we're making it more expensive for municipalities to make that change. But the demand is absolutely there. We in New York, like 6-7 years ago, when we started the debate on climate, what the climate law should look like, there really wasn't AI and data. Now there's an enormous new set of demands on the grid that we have to begin accounting for, and that means we need to double down on the creation of new generation resources in New York, including solar and wind, or we're just not going to meet that demand, and ultimately the state will suffer. Our economy will suffer, which then has that knock-on effect on other policies and programs at the state level.
Well, I have just one more question, and then it's your turn to ask Basil what you want to know about local and state opportunities. But one that seems to me to be perhaps low-hanging fruit now is building codes. Right? That the prospect of building affordable housing that also is green and energy efficient. What are your thoughts on the potential there?
Yeah, I think that's right. Building codes is a really important proving ground for a lot of these concepts. In New York, like many states, we use a code planning process, which is handled by our Department of State. And it's a community driven, it's a public driven process where we update the code every few years, and the code is updated to match the new realities, be it technology or policy initiatives undertaken by the governor. So we have undertaken that in New York. And then we're a home rule state. Again, like many states that are home rule, municipalities then take on their own local codes to suit the state objectives.
Not the president.
Not the president. So the states and municipalities are largely in control of how they build and to what level. So I do think that's fertile ground. Our Climate Action Council in New York State spent an enormous amount of time working with the Department of State to create better model codes so that we could actually achieve all of these various carbon reduction initiatives.
Excellent, excellent. Liz has the microphone. I'm sorry. Ricardo, thank you. Please use the mic even though you think I can hear you. Remember, we're broadcasting this live and we want them to be able to hear your good thoughts.
Hi, this has really just been such a wonderful conversation. My name is Heather Boucher, and I just came out of serving in the Biden administration. So I have like 22 different questions for you. But
Thanks
want
for your service.
Yeah, no, thank you for all you have done and will continue to do. I wanted to just so I'm an economist, and I actually wanted to get a little bit more of your on the ground, the perception that you're having about the economic moment. Right. You talked a little bit about the potential headwinds of a recession this summer. You talked a little bit about the tariffs and the widgets, but can you say a little bit more about what you're hearing from businesses? And so one scenario is we don't actually have a recession because maybe the tariffs don't get implemented, but we just kind of limp along a little bit, right? Maybe there's other economic issues, but we're okay. So if we're okay, are these investments okay? Is there any sort of positive scenario if we don't actually dive into recession? And then second, on the tariff side specifically, and especially knowing New York State, how much of the issue is supply chain complexity leading to problems versus domestic producers who maybe that firm might benefit from tariffs, but all the stuff that they're getting for their supply chain isn't benefiting from tariffs. Do you have any sense of that? So just two questions just for your on the ground experience. And again, thank you. This is really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks again for your time in government. It's always challenging to talk economics with an economist, especially when you're a lawyer. But I will let me weigh in a couple of points. So what am I hearing from businesses and clients? I think it's the full range of reactions right now. Some clients that have mega projects that are in the conceptual phase have more patient, generally more patient backers, right? If their backers are big and diversified, and their pathway to project development success is proven. In other words, they're not trying to create the first, Mr. Fusion on the back of a vehicle, right? To make that get from A to B with no emissions. Contrasted with, mid-size and smaller companies that had a trajectory in mind for many years and are now seeing incredible risk in carrying these things out. And it's really it's the two-pronged problem. It's the money and it's the permitting. So if your capital is at risk, or there's questions about your capital, merged with the uncertainty with which you'd have to get through government processes, that's made certainly some of these businesses certainly withhold commitments, orders, right? It's a bit of a free fall right now. There are examples of companies, again, like I said, there are examples of companies that are sticking with it because they've got the right backers and the right kind of proven concept. But by and large, we're seeing enormous uncertainty at the very grassroots business level. So your second question again was,
I think you've answered it.
yeah.
How much is about the supply chain?
Yeah, supply chain. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the supply chain, I mean, we've been dealing with supply chain issues really since COVID, right? And I think we were just coming around to getting out of the supply chain problem that we had, and its effect on project development. One of the issues obviously was just increased costs, right? Things became more and more expensive. Even when the supply chain recovered and rebounded, things were just more expensive. The IRA, as you know, was designed to keep those costs down, right, as the supply chain recovered. Now we have the IRA being called into question. Supply chain is becoming shakier again on projects and products. So developers are having to put in place, these large buffers, these cost buffers. If something isn't going to be built for actually constructed post permitting for another 4 or 5 years, they have to build in enormous amount of uncertainty into the cost projections that they're putting forward to state regulators. So we see again that full range of clients and businesses doing that to differing success, right? Some having some success with their backers to maintain those projects, to keep them on a generally sound footing, and others that are just hitting the pause button across the board.
Good. Let's move on.
Right, thanks. I'm Rob Werner. I'm the New Hampshire State Director of the League of Conservation Voters and HKS alum. So a lot of the resources from the IRA flowed into so-called red states. And I'm curious as to what you think about those governors, those legislatures in those states that have seen economic benefits accrue from these investments over the last few years. How are they going to react in this environment?
Well, listen, if your project's being canceled, I don't think you're happy. If you're red state or blue state governor, right? Anytime you are impeding economic growth, job opportunities, it doesn't work out well for you politically. No one has stood up yet. I mean, there have been strong governor statements on some of the EOs that have come out. There have been some attorney general actions on some of the projects that are either threatened to be pulled or otherwise. But by and large, it's been quite muted thus far. That's where my head first went when I heard that the IRA itself was going to be targeted. That ultimately, that supply chain, for one wind project in New York is national in scale. Sourcing from red states, Midwest down south. And my first thought was these governors need to start talking together, and not just the U.S. Climate Alliance, but unique arrangements between blue state and red state governors, who are the leading governors in the renewable space. Greg Abbott, he's got more renewable projects going on than most other states. Doug Burgum had a robust wind economy, solar economy in the Dakotas. So I think we've got to find a way to get past politics at the state level, even in the congressional level, because I tell you, there are going to be some changes. There's going to be some pain felt in the congressional districts that are beneficiaries of IRA projects that have been canceled, and people asking why, right? When we're how many months away from the next election cycle. So my hope is that people can bury politics right now, see things for what this is. This is the new economy. And it can fit into the president's rhetoric about an energy emergency if he wants it to. Because if we're going to meet the demand, we have to meet it somehow. And ultimately, those governors and red state Republicans can help to make that case. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Natalie. I'm a second year MPP at HKS. I'm curious, kind of building off the first couple questions, from your perspective, considering A, the legal landscape, and B, like project financing, bankability of different technologies in the climate space or different climate actions, what you think are the most likely paths forward for climate action at the state level or local level in the next couple of years?
I thought you were going to ask for like investment tips.
I mean, if you're offering.
Listen, I think states have to stick to their guns and continue producing plans that can help them meet their carbon reduction targets, and to not pre-negotiate away certain technologies or pathways that are now disfavored at the national level. Be smart about your energy planning and continue moving forward. And if you are an all of the above planner when it comes to energy, then do that. Build that into your plan and make sure it's built across the various portfolios in your agencies. I do think there are some technologies that are going to be sort of more beneficial or greater likelihood of success in the short term. I think geothermal is going to play a big role in the next 4 years. I think solar is going to continue to remain strong. And wind is going to have challenges. Hydro will probably do pretty well, but we've got issues now with Hydro Quebec and Hydro Ontario because of transporter issues. Finding rare minerals, right? Mining is going to be important. Better to do it the right way if we can onshore that here, as opposed to having it done really poorly in developing countries. Nuclear is on the table at the federal level. There's nuclear development, nuclear research. And New York is one of those states that is kind of trying to get out front on that. But listen, we've got an energy emergency in the sense that we have a climate emergency and we also have a demand emergency. And states need to continue focusing on developing and implementing plans that kind of take all of that into account and pushing that forward.
Hi, thank you. My name's Henry Lee, and I have worked in different times in my life in state government, quite a long time ago, I admit. But I have a detailed question and a broad question. The detailed question is one of the dilemmas that I can remember, and this, again, I may be dating myself, was a lot of our operating expenses when I was doing the environment stuff was coming out of the federal government. A lot of our employees, we got a lot of money for air inspectors and water inspectors and things like this. And bond issues were capital money. And our Constitution would not allow us to take capital money and use it for operating expenses. So yes, we could get bond issues passed off, and we were fairly successful at it, but we had very significant trouble with minor cuts in the federal budget. And now you got major cuts in the federal budget. What happens to the ability of states in order to enforce existing environmental, basically water and air pollution rules? My broad question is, one of the tensions that we've seen, particularly in the last 2 years, has been this tension between the climate goals and cheap energy. And what we saw here was very high gas prices this last winter. Now we're trying to do anything we can to keep those gas prices down. And so there's a tension. If you look at meeting the climate goals, there's at least a probability that it will put upward pressure on prices. On the other hand, there's this consumer effort to keep lower prices on energy. How do you deal with this tension in terms of the cost of energy?
Yeah. Let me take your first question first. States where New York was a state that had delegated programs. You're Massachusetts, you were Mass. Yeah. So delegated programs. So we were implementing federal law in New York, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and RCRA as well. And that means about 85% of our staff in New York were on the state budget. It was about 12.5 to 15% were on the federal grants. That gave us a bit more cushion because we had majority of our staff sort of on the state dime. But 15% cut of staff at an agency of 3,000 would have been devastating to us. Yes, we could have moved things around, and ultimately the state could have said, we agree that this is important, and we're going to continue dedicating resources to it and backfill what the federal government might have taken away. But you can do that when you can project solid tax returns, tax revenue, right? So if you have, to the economists of the room, if you have everyone taking a haircut on their bonuses in December, and you're relying on those bonuses to fund the general fund's contributions towards staffing, then you're really in trouble, right? Because then that cycle breaks down, and you're looking at potential staff cuts. DC used to be a staff of 4,000 in New York. During the financial crisis in the late 2000s, we lost about 1,000 staff. Never really built it back up. It took almost 15 years to get back up to 3,300, which is where we are now. But that was because of the financial crisis, not because of the federal government. Now you have a potential financial crisis on top of cuts at EPA. Those cuts at EPA, in a way, will impede projects in New York. Right, will slow things down because things can't, when they need federal review, can't get reviewed. And then you've got, pass-through dollars that are being restricted or conditioned, that then makes that 12 to 15% number that you have much more difficult. So so we're thinking about that quite a bit in New York. I assume most states are, but not every state is as well positioned, I think. It's great to be able to go after bond acts. Everyone loves a bond act. Every governor loves projecting things out on bonding. That can be a reliable source of good news for 20, 30 years if you do it right. So that's unfortunately where we find ourselves now at the state level. Yeah, the cost issue. So we lived that pretty closely when I was at DEC. Again, the easy stuff was getting the law passed. The tough stuff was in implementing it. And I think the supply chain issues, the COVID pause didn't help anything. Everything became a lot more expensive, and everything got delayed to a degree. But cost and reliability, those two things emerged as the two most critical issues two most critical forces opposing moving ahead aggressively. And that was good. I sort of embraced that debate because it helped us to create and craft smarter policies. You can't put out a policy just to slow down the flow of carbon emissions. You can't create a policy that then cripples low and middle income New Yorkers. We just couldn't do it. So we had to rely on a really strong federal partner to provide funding for projects to keep costs down. We had to develop programs that took into account low and middle income. I mean, squarely. So when I left, we were in the midst of creating our cap and invest program. Cap emissions, have auction proceeds, invest those, declining cap emissions go down over time. But those emissions proceeds could have been, and will be, once it's done, extraordinary for New York. You know, multiple billions of dollars per year from carbon control going into the economy. And what we were crafting was a program that would have taken those proceeds, a portion of those proceeds, and actually given it right back to low and middle income. What we projected was most people, low and middle income, would be better off actually after the project itself got underway. And yet cost remained a challenge, right? Because you have to make that transition. You've got to get to the next level of the project from conception into implementation. And it's that middle ground, right? So at what point do you start charging so that you have money to pass on when prices go up? Because prices would go up, right? Reliability is the other end of that, right? Straining the grid, putting too much renewables in the grid at the expense of generation sources that were more constant. That was the other challenge, and will remain a major challenge, I think, for the industry for many years until we find ways to normalize a generation across the grid. Yeah.
Other questions?
What do I see as for those listening, the role of utilities? Well, obviously, utilities have to be at the table, right? State public service commissions, controlling utilities, the ISOs that control the grid itself and assess demand and supply. The utilities have to play a role. I mean, I think largely they're to do what they're told. That is sort of how the utilities operate in large part. But utilities can become more forward-leaning. I think we have some that operate, I think, with more concern for the future and more kind of progressive thinking as to investments that can be made. We have in New York, Con Ed, National Con Ed has been leaning forward on some innovative projects. National Grid, similarly, you've got to create the headspace for them to make change, and ultimately, they're going to be concerned with: are the lights going to be on? Are they going to be providing enough power, heating in the winter? And governors, utility commissions, and ISOs absolutely need to be giving them the right directions so they can make long-term investments and be able to weather supply chain problems as they occur.
Other questions? So, Basil, many of the people in the room are here today at the Kennedy School because they want to be leaders in climate. You've had an extraordinary career in the nonprofit, government, and the private sector, lawyers. I'm just wondering if you could share some of your insights about, well, just advice about how do you show up and get things done.
Yeah.
And if you have a moment after that to also talk about what you're doing in Ukraine.
Listen, I think, how many people actually want to go into government? Harvard Kennedy School of Government, I think most. Well, that's fantastic. Look, if you've already served or if you want to serve, I think you know it, right? You need to be tenacious. You really do. That's just a really important, I think, certainly approach to the job is being tenacious, but also, going in for the right reasons and being there for the long haul. I think making investment in yourself to be a public servant. It takes enormous sacrifice, and I think you need to embrace the sacrifice to be effective. You could do easier things than taking a real salary cut to go work in a government job where, quite frankly, you go into these positions sometimes without the greatest deal of respect from people out in the communities that you serve. And I think always remembering that you're in these jobs for the opportunity to fight for other people. That if you keep that in mind and you're tenacious about it, I think then it becomes infectious in the way that you operate, the way that you run your staff, the way that you interact with communities. You're given the opportunity to do enormous things with the the sort of the power and the ability that you have in front of you. I think people are craving results. They're craving action. They're craving better lives. And going into these jobs, you have the opportunity to do just that. I never had a bad day in government. I had really tough days, but I never had bad days. I just truly loved that job. I loved the opportunity to do really, hopefully, what was good things for people. You'll never, as tough as it can be sometimes with having limited income, having the stresses of the job, taking incoming from sectors of the population. I think you'll still find it to be the most rewarding thing you would ever do in your entire life is to serve others. So there are lots of approaches to that, but I would say go in for the right reasons and be prepared to stay and be prepared to keep your ears open and just be tenacious about it. And you'll find it to be the best thing you ever did. So, you wanted me to say something about Ukraine?
Well, given that you have had already a huge day job, I think people would be interested.
Okay. So I'll just touch on Ukraine briefly. So when I was commissioner, I took 3 leaves of absence to go over to Ukraine after the full-scale invasion to deliver humanitarian aid. I just got back from my 4th trip a few weeks ago. Have since delivered I think something like 315 ambulances and Land Rovers for evacuation of injured soldiers from the front and civilians. We did the math on this. I'm part of this really small group. I should back up a second. It's called Ukraine Focus. Very small group. It's just volunteers, basically a couple of full-time staff from in country, one from the U.S. here, and we've just raised funds for the purchase of ambulances, mostly from Europe, but some from the U.S. here. We brought in thousands of these first aid kits as well. So now in the 4th year of the war, I've done 4 missions. There's been, I think, 15 total missions, 315 ambulances. Those each ambulances lasts about 2 months before it's targeted. We've driven these things all the way to the front. We hand them right over to the soldiers, give them supplies and bring in mechanics and everything else to do final checks on these things. Lasts about 2 months before they're targeted, or they fall apart. Some do. But in those 2 months, the ambulances save about 150 to 200 people. That's the math over these 3 years. So 150,000, or rather, 315 ambulances. The math on it is about 180,000 people that have been pulled off the front. So this is just a ragtag band of the volunteers with money chiefly from American philanthropists who have enabled us to buy these things and bring them in, and that could be it's a force multiplier on the battlefield to ultimately take 150,000 people out of certain dire situation, back to triage units, ultimately, getting the medical care they need, getting back to their families, or getting back into the fighting. And that can really help to turn the tide of the war. So I did it for, I think, simple reason. I just couldn't sit on the sidelines while it was happening and wanted to help and knew I could do a few things here and there. Knew I could raise some money, knew I could drive an ambulance, and I wanted to pitch in on what I believed was something that impacts all of us, this war and what trajectory it takes, and what the world may look like if Ukraine falls, and we're not there to support this democratic ally. So I didn't want that to happen. Wanted to do what I could. We did a small piece, and now we see it at the highest levels of our country being decided. So it's a very delicate moment, I think, on all these issues, whether it's clean energy or Ukraine or tariffs or supply chain. And I'm just excited to be here at Harvard, where so many amazing students and professionals are coming through here, learning from each other, learning from this institution, and being part of an institution that stands up for itself. I think is going to serve you well in your careers. So I hope you go out there and join government, take up causes, be active in your communities, lead organizations, and make the world a stronger place. So thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.